So whether you're just getting started in your filmmaking career or if you've been in the industry for a while already, I think everyone who's ever tried to take shooting video seriously can agree that getting a successful filmmaking career off the ground is incredibly difficult. But even though the market in general seems to be in a bit of a nosedive at the moment, 2024 has actually been one of the best years of my career, with more job offers coming in than I can handle. So why is that? Well, honestly, I give most of the credit to a set of 10 rules I've operated under for my entire career, rules that I've stuck to through good times and bad, and that I plan to stick to for many more years to come. And if this stuff helped me go from shooting low-budget local news spots to DPing big-budget series for Netflix and National Geographic in just a couple of years, they can absolutely work for you too. Okay, so I realize that any video called 10 Rules for Anything makes me sound a bit like Jordan Peterson or something, and that's not the vibe I'm going for at all. This isn't about me telling you what you have to do, and it's definitely not about me telling you what to buy. But I really do think there are a few core philosophies, which I'll call rules here, that are going to help you avoid some painful mistakes that can derail your career before you have the chance to get started. So with that said, let's dive right in because there's a lot to cover here. I'm going to lead with the rule that I've probably struggled with the most, just because especially in the beginning, it can feel hard to be confident in your decisions. But if you want to stay true to yourself and avoid getting tangled up in disastrous projects, you have to listen to your gut. To demonstrate what I'm talking about, it's probably easiest just to give you a personal example, because last summer I found myself in a bit of a slump, I guess you'd call it, and I was getting a bit desperate for a job. Then one day a producer emailed me from overseas and asked if I'd be willing to shoot a pseudoscience piece of branded content. And even though I was excited to have an offer finally, starting from that first conversation, things felt a little weird. I'm not going to get into the details because the whole thing turned into a giant mess that I just want to leave in the past, and I'm pretty sure these are the kind of people who would be more than happy to sue me. But basically, they wanted me to make a documentary, quote unquote, that was really just one big sales video for a bunch of health products. I felt pretty uneasy about the whole thing from the beginning, but they were offering good money and I wasn't doing much else, so I set aside my doubts and I kept going forwards. I even did almost 20 hours of pre-production work and preliminary interviews, even though things just kept getting weirder and weirder feeling. Then one day during a production meeting, one of the producers made some pretty, let's say, distasteful comments that definitely didn't fit well with my personal worldview, and I knew I had to get off the project, or it could be one of those messes that haunt my reputation forever just by being associated with it. So I sent an email saying that there was no way I could keep going in light of what had been said and cut off all future communications. But by that time, I'd already spent so much time and energy that I could never get back, and I would have been so much better off just doing something else from the beginning, even if that was just making YouTube videos and spending my time with friends. And the worst part was, I knew it was a bad idea from the start. I ignored my instincts because I wanted to believe I'd found a good gig, and in the end I got burned. So whether it's a producer who feels dodgy or a story that seems to be going in a direction you're not comfortable with, you're most likely better off staying away in the long run. Okay, so now let's talk about gear, because one of the most common questions I get asked is this camera good enough to shoot documentaries? And then insert whatever brand name here. Like, is the Blackmagic Pocket Cam or a GH5 or A7C or whatever up to the job? And the answer is pretty much always yes. You can get amazing results with almost any camera these days, but does that mean it's the best long-term investment? No, because the reality is that every sector of the industry has its go-to gear for renting, and when it's possible, it's a good rule to invest in gear with a long-term mindset. Yes, it's entirely possible to shoot an award-winning doc with any camera from a GoPro to an Alexa, but is a production company or doc director likely to want to pay you to bring that camera with you? That's a different story. Like, even for me, I own an FX9, which is a pretty high-end camera, but I was recently told by a production company who was interviewing me that they had a no Sony policy and that they'd only work with C500s. Now, do I agree that the FX9 is way worse and can't match a C500 with a good lens and solid grading? No, not really. And the identical price tag tells me that Sony and Canon feel pretty much the same as I do. But it's the director's decision to make, and there's no point in arguing. My point is, if you're buying gear to shoot your own projects, get whatever you like, because almost any camera will do these days. But if you're investing in a kit that you hope you can bring and rent out on big projects, figure out what the people in your niche want and invest accordingly. In network documentary, that probably means an FX9 over an FX3, even though the raw image quality is pretty comparable. If it's commercials, then a Red makes more sense than Sony's. All cameras are good these days, but that doesn't mean producers see them equally, and more expensive isn't always the answer. So do your research and invest in what the industry wants, not what the internet makes you like. And one more quick one while we're talking about gear. A rule that I think almost everyone out there should follow is to never buy gear on credit. Now, it can be super tempting to swipe your card on something a little bit beyond your budget with the dream that once you have the camera, the work will start to come in. But that's not how it works most of the time. My opinion is that if you can't pay in cash or mostly in cash, then you can't afford it. And honestly, I think it's a big part of the reason why I've been able to stick around through hard times. I'm just never in debt, especially for gear. Now, if you have a 100% guarantee, like a contract, signed, flights booked type guarantee for a big upcoming project where you can make your money back fast, then sure, in that situation, swipe away. But if you're just banking on the dream of the work coming in once you have the gear, please don't. Either save more money or buy something cheaper, but don't go into debt for gear or you're setting yourself up for disaster. And while we're talking about getting through rough patches, the next rule I have is just straight up lifted from every financial planning influencer in history. A career in filmmaking is full of ups and downs, even at the highest levels. Sometimes you're gonna have more jobs than you can comfortably handle, like I do right now, and sometimes you're not gonna work for months. And if you want to avoid having to sell off all your gear to pay your rent or set your dreams aside while you take a job bussing tables, I strongly advise building up an emergency fund as quickly as possible. Nothing crazy here, but a few months of basic living expenses in an account that you don't touch can be the difference between getting through a dry spell and having to move back into your parents' basement after selling off all your gear. Now, my emergency fund is the only reason I got through COVID in one piece. And since then, I've made it a firm rule not to buy any new gear until that fund is back in place. It's not a slush fund for new lenses or an upgraded drone. It's your lifeline in the dark times, and so don't touch it unless it's really an emergency. It saved me, and it might save you one day. And if you're interested in learning more about how I grew my career through the ups and downs, I wrote a 70-page ebook that goes over some of the life-changing advice I've gotten throughout my career, and you can download it completely for free. So check it out in the description if you're interested, but it's helped thousands of filmmakers already, and it doesn't cost anything. Okay, let's pivot here and talk about where work comes from as a filmmaker, because just owning gear and having a slick reel is not enough to bring in your dream clients. For that, you're gonna need to meet people, or to put it another way, you need to network. And networking is just a dirty word for getting your name out there and making the connections you need to land jobs. And if you wanna go far, you need to treat networking as a built-in cost of doing business. Whether that's flying yourself to a film festival or taking a trip to New York to meet with production managers, effective networking usually requires spending money. Now, it would be great if an email to a stranger was all you needed to do to land new clients. But in my experience, that rarely works. Like these days, my inbox gets flooded every time I make a new video, and they're all pretty much the same. It's like, hey, I'm a new filmmaker with a dream and I want work. There's more to them than that, obviously, but if I really break them down, that's what they're saying fundamentally. And while I do respect the effort, if you put yourself in the shoes of whoever's on the receiving end of those emails, I think you can see why it's not very effective. You might be the greatest crew member I could ever dream of, but at the end of the day, I don't know you. I have no sense of your vibe, and most of the time, the people writing to me live super far away. That's just not likely to result in a gig, I'm sorry. But if you were to message me and say, hey, I'm coming to your city and I'd love to meet you at a coffee shop close to your house at a time that's convenient for you to introduce myself, then it's way easier to say yes. That's why when I was getting started, I'd set aside a bit of cash every year to fly to New York, only with the aim of doing meetings. It was definitely expensive, but it worked. So start squirreling away a little cash for networking, because it's just the cost of growing a career, and wishing it were different doesn't make it so. And while I'm on the subject of drumming up new work for yourself, the next rule that's helped me a ton over the years, especially the early years, was passed on to me from another DP who I assisted almost 10 years ago now. At that time, I only had maybe a dozen or so total jobs under my belt, and most of those were short news pieces and corporate interviews. At the end of the shoot, he said that I'd done a great job, and as a reward for working so hard, he was going to pass on my name to another producer he knew who was looking for last-minute crew. Now, I was really excited at the idea of booking back-to-back high-profile jobs until he asked me to send through my resume and reel as soon as possible because they were looking to hire someone by the end of the day. The problem was I didn't have those things ready. In the end, I didn't get the job because they hired someone else a few hours later, and it turned out that that person had even less experience than me, so I'm guessing with the personal recommendation, I probably would have gotten the job if I'd had my documents in order. That experience taught me a lesson I've never forgotten. Always keep your CV and maybe reel up to date, especially when you're just starting out. These are the kind kind of annoying tasks that get endlessly bumped off your to-do list for more interesting work, and it's easy to keep telling yourself, I'll do it next week or whenever. But the reality is that when you need those things, you usually need them right away. I think newer filmmakers delay getting started on these things because they're kind of hoping that if they wait long enough, they'll be able to make them better and more impressive before they have to share them. But that's a dangerous approach because a lot of early career gigs tend to come about in the same way as they did for me. Someone you know is going to reach out and say, I have something for you last minute, please send through your resume or reel right away. Now these days I don't really have a reel anymore because at a certain point it's better to show a resume and a selection of finished projects than a highlight reel. But in the beginning, you should build out your CV and reel as early as possible and then constantly update them with your newest work. So don't wait, even if you don't have a lot to show just yet. Just make the best 60-second reel you can and get a basic resume template going and then update it over time. When the time comes to show it, you'll be glad you have those things ready, even if they're not as good as you want them to be one day. And when you do get that job, the hard work is just beginning because now you're actually gonna have to deliver on what you say you can do. Because we're all a little insecure early on, this can lead to the classic rookie mistake of being so excited to have a job that you promise your new clients the moon just because you're terrified they're gonna look somewhere else if you don't say yes to everything. But that can come back to bite you because when you've told them that you can easily shoot like a beautiful 2-camera interview and get a ton of B-roll and cover an emotional verite scene in a single afternoon, despite not really having the gear for it, you're setting yourself up for failure. That's why setting very clear expectations with clients is a rule that every filmmaker should follow, at least in my opinion. If there isn't enough time to get what they want, you have to tell them. If you don't have a strong enough key light and need to rent one, then say so. If you don't think it's possible to get all the shots on their list in the time they're giving you, then tell them. It might be terrifying to tell a client that their expectations are unrealistic, but it's usually much better than over-promising and under-delivering. It's a fine line between pushing yourself outside your comfort zone and then just straight up lying about what you're capable of, but I've learned the hard way that being upfront about what's possible within a certain budget or time frame, or even my own abilities, is always the best approach. Don't undersell yourself, but be realistic and clear. If they want something that can't be done and threaten to take the job somewhere else, then you probably don't want that job anyways. The pain of having a client mad at you after a job will hurt more than the awkwardness of saying no early on. But let's say then that you are clear and the client still has unreasonable expectations, no matter how upfront you were about what could be done. How are you supposed to handle that? Well, obviously you need to be polite and professional, but as a rule, you also have to learn to stand up for yourself and what you believe in, and be willing to say no. For a personal example, let's go back to that weird health doc I mentioned earlier. At the time, I was in a bit of a dry spell. Like I said, I could have really used that job, but there were alarm bells going off all over the place during our pre-pro calls. First, they wanted to cover an incredible amount of ground, basically just trying to make a full feature film with over 20 interviews in just over 2 weeks of shooting time. And I pushed back and I was very clear about the fact that they wanted too much, but they were adamant it could be done. Then we had that fateful meeting where they said what they said. Again, I'm being vague out of fear of American lawyers.
Who can I sue? Who can you sue?
But that was the final straw, and I knew I had to stand up for what I believed in. As a freelancer, it's important to be flexible and amiable to ideas from your clients, but at a certain point, enough is enough. Yes, it's scary, especially when you're early on in your career and every job matters, but if you don't stand up for yourself, no one else will. Because when things go wrong, it's already too late. All right, let's shift gears here and end on a more positive note. As you get deeper into this weird business and you get more and more jobs, it's really easy to get into a pattern of not shooting anything unless you're being paid for it. Now, I'm guilty of this myself, and it's one of the reasons this YouTube channel has been so good for my overall creativity, because it forces me to constantly create even if there's no client involved. But as you get busier and busier, it's really common only to be making other people's projects, and unless you get really lucky, you're probably gonna feel like most of those could have been a little bit better if only you'd been allowed to do things your own way. And that's why it's so important to make time for your personal work, to the point where I try to make it a rule for me to shoot at least one thing every year that's mine alone. Now, your personal projects are where you can really show your full range of skills and your vision as a filmmaker, free from client notes and oversight. These are the projects that showcase what you bring to the table and the ones you can point to and say, this is what we could achieve if you just let me do my thing. But too often, once the work starts flowing in, the personal projects projects get pushed off to the side, and in the long term, that's a mistake. Because when you meet someone you really want to make a good impression on, professionally speaking, it doesn't help to show a bunch of okay work and then try and explain why the producer screwed you or the editor dropped the ball or whatever. No one cares. Instead, you have to show them what your best creative effort looks like, and that means making time for your own stuff. And the last rule for this video is sort of related, and I'll just straight up come out with it. Always be open to working for free if the right opportunity comes up. Now, there's a very fine line between volunteering and exploitation, and if you look around YouTube enough, you'll probably find lots of people telling you that you should never ever work for free. But in my experience, there are so many more ways to be paid than just with money, and some of the best opportunities of my career have come from connections made or skills that I've learned while working for free. Now, this only makes sense if you can gain something from the project, either because you think the people involved could be good connections moving forwards, or maybe you might learn something you can apply to your own work later. And even though I've been doing this for most of my adult life now, I'll still work for free if those boxes are ticked. Like, even as recently as 3 months ago, I worked on a narrative film proof of concept totally for free, and I even supplied all the gear for the shoot at no extra charge because I wanted to learn. As a doc specialist, I don't get asked to work with actors very often, but it's still something I'm kind of interested in, and so it made sense to do it even at a loss. And it was worth it, because when I wrapped, I had a nice little narrative reel to show, plus down the road when that director eventually got funding, they came back to me with a cash offer to shoot the whole film for them. Whether or not I can do it, we'll have to see, but you're never too experienced to work for free if there's something to learn or a new connection to be made. So there we go, 10 rules I've tried to stick to over the years that have helped me succeed as a filmmaker. It's a competitive industry and it takes a long time to see results, but if you try and follow these rules for yourself, I think you'll find a lot more success in the long term. And if you want to know more about my journey from a personal perspective, grab that free ebook because it's full of life-changing advice that made a massive impact on my career. See ya!